Hi, this is Newt. Due to the virus, I'm recording from home, so you may notice a difference in audio quality. On this episode of Newt's World, when we talk about Black Lives Matter, my guest today has made the well-being of the Black community his lifelong mission. Robert L. Woodson Sr. founded the Woodson Center in 1981 to help residents of low-income neighborhoods address the problems of their communities. A former civil rights activist, he has headed the National Urban League Department of Criminal Justice and has been a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Foundation for Public Policy Research. Referred to by many as godfather of the neighborhood empowerment movement, for more than 4 decades, Woodson has had a special concern for the problems of youth. In response to an epidemic of youth violence that has afflicted urban, rural, and suburban neighborhoods alike, I'm pleased to welcome my guest and good friend, Robert Woodson Sr. I have worked with Bob off and on all the way back into the Reagan years. He had an enormous impact on Jack Kemp and on myself and others. His new book, Lessons from the Least of These, The Woodson Principles, will be released on December 8th, 2020, and will be a very timely addition to where we are now. So let me start, Bob, if I could, and just ask you to spend a minute or two about the journey you've been on, because you've really had a remarkable life, and I don't think it was necessarily predictable in any way.
I was a veteran of the civil rights movement, Newt, but I parted company with the movement in the 60s over the issues of forced busing for integration. I believe that the opposite of segregation is desegregation, not integration. And I think if you pursue excellence, then that will attract people. Integration ought to be a response to excellence. I had this debate with Julius Chambers, who was a NAACP lawyer, Harvard graduate, before the New York Bar Association, arguing this point. So I asked him halfway through the debate, I said, if we have situation A, where there's all Black and there's a presence of educational excellence, in situation B, where you have it's integrated where there's diminished excellence, where should we send our children? And so that was one point. But also, I realized that we were demonstrating outside of a pharmaceutical company when they desegregated. They hired 9 Black PhD chemists, and we asked them to join this movement. They said they got this because they were qualified. And so I left the movement when I realized that many of the people who sacrificed for civil rights did not benefit from the change. And I saw when voting rights came that a lot of Black activists came in and became elected to public office at a time when the poverty programs were arriving, where 70% of those $22 trillion went to people to provide service to the poor. Low-income Blacks and all poor people became a commodity in the 60s, where people concentrated on solving problems that were fundable, not ones that were solvable. And so I parted company and began to work on behalf of low-income people of all races, because Dr. King said, what good does it do to have the right to eat in a restaurant of your choice or to live in a neighborhood of your choosing if you don't have the means to exercise that right? So I spent a lot of time helping low-income people prepare themselves when the doors of opportunity open. That's kind of where we are right now, and I think that the people have used the race issue to divide this country. I'm doing everything I can to push back against the forces of trying to define America as a criminal enterprise because of the issue of slavery. So that's my latest undertaking.
Now, I remember you were very active in the Reagan years. As you look back on that and that whole experience, and then with Kemp when he was Secretary of HUD, what lessons did you learn during that period?
What I learned is the principles that operate in our market economy must operate in the social economy. And that is only 3% of the people in our market economy are entrepreneurs, but they generate 70% of all the new jobs. And so I worked a lot with Jack Kemp, demonstrate this with public housing. As you know, residents at Cochran and St. Louis drove out the drug dealers, started running, changing their behavior. And as a consequence, they created an island of excellence of peace, and market rate housing was built right across the street from public housing, and the new residents became a part of the public housing community association. Throughout the Reagan years, we got resistance from all kinds of quarters, people who were strongly in support of these contractors who had been literally robbing public housing. The more people tear up the house, the more they got contracts. So we were really fighting upstream against corrupt contractors. So we were fighting against an industry that profited from the despair of the poor. And so we really had to fight back.
You went from that to creating the Woodson Center. Tell us about the Woodson Center.
As you know, when you were speaker and we were brought together grassroots groups to advise you on welfare reform, I realized that there needs to be a strong presence among policymakers and the philanthropic community. So the Woodson Center was really established to provide the means of poor people to have a voice in policy and practice.
And is it primarily based in Washington?
We're headquartered in Washington, D.C., and we have provided service to 2,500 grassroots leaders that are in 39 states. And we literally go into these communities where the poverty industry only looks at the 70% of the families that are raising children that are dysfunctional. We go into the 30% of people in these neighborhoods who are achieving against the odds to find out from them what are the successful strategies that they have employed in these toxic, drug-infested neighborhoods to raise children successfully. And then we apply the lessons from the 30% to affect change among the 70%. And so that has proven to be a very effective strategies to rebuild these communities from the inside out instead of the top down.
Well, I noticed that Baylor University actually did a case study in Milwaukee and said that your efforts on violence-free zones led to a 9% increase in grade point average for students, 8% higher graduation rate. It's very encouraging.
Also, Pastor Buster Soares in Somerset, New Jersey, has a model for how you transform a whole urban neighborhood from a drug-infested to where there are small businesses moving into that community. Public housing looks like middle-class housing. It all depends, Newt. The problem that we have with addressing poverty, we assume that if you give people jobs, education, and housing, and they'll improve their life. Well, some people, that is true. There's no single cause of poverty. There are three categories. Those that are just broke, but their values are intact. For them, if you give them opportunities, welfare is used as an ambulance service, not a transportation system. There are others whose character is intact, but there are perverse incentives. If they get a job, they lose health benefits. So if you can take out the disincentives, they will be fine. But the third group that concerns us, that creates a problem, are people who are poor because of the chances that they take and the values that they pursue. And so for them, they must be redeemed and transformed as a precondition for them to take advantage of opportunity. And so most of our grassroots groups around the country are faith-centered. They know that in order for a person to be able to function, there must be a change in their value system. So after a person has been transformed and redeemed, then from drugs and from violent behavior, from predatory attitudes, our grassroots leaders understand that if people are to be reclaimed and redeemed, that have opportunities, they first must take that step to change themselves. But the left doesn't want to hear that. Whenever they talk about the poor, it's all external, as if what is lacking is a proper governmental transactions. And that's just not true. You can actually injure with the helping hand by providing resources to people who have corrupt attitudes or dysfunctional values.
You really have both an individual salvation model as well as a neighborhood salvation model.
One or two individuals, once their character changes, Newt, their characteristic has an advantage because then they serve as witnesses to others that change and improvement is possible.
When you were helping us think through the Welfare Reform Act, which is still, I think, the most successful conservative social act on modern times, which led to the largest number of children leaving poverty at any point in modern American history. When you were helping us with that, one of the things that had really impressed me was a book called The Tragedy of American Compassion, which argued basically that the Johnson Great Society, big bureaucracy model exactly violated every principle that successful reformers had known in the last 150 years. It has to involve individual change. It has to involve applying principles that work. And as your new book will point out, you have really worked hard to understand the principles of the successful 30%, so you can then try to migrate them into the 70% who currently don't have those principles. If you were summarizing them for a minute, what you think are the key principles that every policymaker should be aware of in approaching this?
Yes. Well, some of the principles, for instance, the first one is when you approach a community that's in decline, don't come in just because it looks dysfunctional. Always look for strengths. In other words, just like a venture capitalist comes into a situation, they look for an entrepreneur. Don't come in and see what appears to be a dysfunctional community, and you come in and you parachute your solutions into that community. And so that's one. The second one, so you have to look for indigenous solutions. Once you find them, it is important to listen and to be guided by them. And then when you are applying help, make sure the help does not hinder and you're easy with the helping hand. The second point is to be on tap and not on top. Because the biggest barrier we face today is elitism, the assumption that someone who is untutored is unwise and therefore incapable of offering innovative remedies to problems.
Expand just a little bit, because it's a brilliant line, that you need to be on tap but not on top. I think it's brilliant, but it took me a second or two to realize how really smart it was.
Well, I'll give you an example. When I was advising Jeb Bush, when he ran, I introduced him to a woman named Dorothy Perry, who was like the Mother Teresa of public housing. And so Jeb said, well, me and my wife, we want to take 20 of these kids to their home to swim and take them to the amusement park. I said, don't you do that. I said, you go in and partner with Ma Dot so that it is Ma Dot taking the kids with your help. Because otherwise you're competing with her. You're saying to these kids, come to my nice house and swim and have a good time, or stay here with Dorothy Perry, who loves you. Rather than set it up as an informal competition, come in and build on what she has done. So you are coming in to enhance an existing relationship so that it strengthens everything you should do to try to strengthen existing relationships and resources that are in that community and not inadvertently compete. You have a lot of nice people who want to start charter schools or take kids out to their house for summer camps and do all of these things that are done by well-meaning people. They don't know that sometimes they're injuring people with the helping hand.
What do you find is the biggest resistance to your message?
There are two groups of people who disturb me most, and that is self-flagellating, guilty white people and rich, angry, entitled Black people with their victims' books. That's the biggest. And people who are unwilling, because of race, to be honest with people. And also elitism, coming from both the left and the right. I think Bill Bennett, I remember back in those days, he said, when people on the left look at the poor, they see a sea of victims, and people on the right see a sea of aliens.
Sadly, there's a lot to that.
Yes. And so elitism, Newt, is really this belief that it's just interesting. In our market economy, it is not true. David Birch at MIT many years ago, they looked at the characteristics of successful entrepreneurs. They tend to be C students. A students come back and teach, C students come back and endow. Because a lot of smart people sometimes have to have all the answers before they act, and when they act, the opportunity is gone.
With all the work you've done and the successes you've had in specific places, how do you react to Black Lives Matter and demonstrations?
Anger, because they are exploiting and hustling Black people. They are appropriating the rich legacy of the civil rights movement and using it to bludgeon this country, to use it to condemn this country. They're flying under the flag of social justice. But recent events prove what their real agenda is. The very fact that Black Lives Matter, that says they're doing this for George Floyd and pursue racial justice for blacks, in fact, are burning flags and burning Bibles, condemning the nuclear family as Eurocentric and therefore racist, to say that the cross is racist. It was the nuclear family and Christian faith that have brought Black Americans through slavery up until the 60s. That's what has brought us through. Between 1930 and 1940, when racism was enshrined in law, and blacks had no political representation, when the unemployment rate was 40% in the black community, we had the highest marriage rate of any group in society, and elderly people could walk safely in their community without fear of being assaulted by their grandchildren. This was our protection in the storm. It was our Christian faith. It was our nuclear families that caused that. Now, for Black Lives Matter to say they are acting on the moral authority of social justice and the civil rights movement, to say that the family and faith are racist, they reveal themselves as being an enemy to Black people, not their champion. But they are exploiting that racial justice piece, vilifying the police, and as a result of the police being vilified, they withdraw from enforcing the laws aggressively, so the murder rate goes up, and then Black Lives Matter gets paid more money by American corporations to continue to profit off a problem they've helped create.
When you were on C-SPAN in June, you were very tough about this idea of defunding the police.
It has been proven for over the last 10 years that I've studied this, that the more police are called nullification or the Ferguson Effect. I'll give you an example. 10 years ago in Cincinnati, a young white police officer shot a teenager who stopped as he was running and turned around as if he had a weapon in his hand. So Al Sharpton and the rest of them organized a boycott of Cincinnati. And as a result, the police said, well, if we're going to be accused of racism for enforcing the laws, then we won't do that in those communities. And so the murder rate went up 800% in 1 year, but none of the civil rights leaders or political leaders lived in those communities that were suffering an increase in murders. And so this is a pattern now that has occurred throughout the country, and there are even studies to support that the more police are nullified, the less they enforce the laws, the higher the murder rate. That's why the murder rate right now, black-on-black murder rate, more blacks, Newt, were killed in 1 year by other blacks than 50 years by the Klan. We have a 9/11 every 6 months, and only about a third of the murders ever get arrested. And that's because the Black Lives Matter has sown the seeds of distrust of police, so people are not testifying. But we have a violence-free zone effort going in Washington, D.C. that you'll hear more about. This is one of the most dangerous neighborhoods. For the last 86 days, there has not been a violent incident, even in the July 4th weekend, and that is because one of our groups decided that they were going to impose discipline within So we are still demonstrating that it's possible, but the answer will not be found by funding Black Lives Matter. They've got over $1 billion, Newt, flowing into Black Lives Matter to do what?
You know, I think that's almost a social statement so that they will feel good about themselves, as opposed to a serious effort to help anybody. But let me ask you something I've been very curious about for, I guess, the last 15 or 20 years. When you have an area like the south side of Chicago, which has such a large endemic violence pattern, which has schools that don't work and has neighborhoods without jobs, why has it been so hard to launch a reform movement built around safety, jobs, and learning? As you point out, and this is why I'm fascinated with your work, it has to grow out of the community and be integral to the community. But it just strikes me that the failure of the system is so enormous that there ought to be some kind of opportunity for a very different approach to taking on an establishment which has clearly failed.
But let me tell you, there are voices of dissent, even in Chicago. But again, Soros is pouring in millions of dollars to rent a rioter. And the left invests in a ground game, dude. They give all of these people who are running for office and all of these loudmouth protesters a microphone. There needs to be investment in the dissident voices. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to raise the resources so that we can give voice to the insurgents in these communities. And there are a lot of insurgents, but they don't have a place, a landing spot. That's why 1776 has been the place that they now are turning to. We are collecting all of these insurgent voices. We're developing a curriculum that will counter 1619. We're developing a strategy to counter what they're doing, but we're not going to do it by setting up a debate club with them. What we're offering, as you saw in my column, an aspirational and an inspirational examples of resilience. And we want to turn a lot of those kind of stories into curriculum. We want to have a full-scale advertising campaign. In other words, we want to take the 2,500 grassroots leaders that are part of our network over the past 38 years and resource them so they can begin to speak for themselves and they can begin to rise up. There's some lessons. Look at the 2018 and the gubernatorial race in Florida, where DeSantis defeated Gillum, the black mayor of Tampa. DeSantis won by 32,000 votes, and that's because 100,000 low-income blacks voted for the Republican because of his position on choice and vouchers and education. Okay? Now, Gillum had Barack Obama and Oprah Winfrey come in and campaign for them. That means 100,000 low-income black people voted against Obama, voted against Oprah. So that means that there is an opportunity, but I don't see much made of that. That's a major breakthrough, and it can happen all over this country, but it takes paying attention to it. There are too many conservatives are waiting for the next liberal blow to their gut, or they're waiting to surrender, and this country's finished.
I think that's right. That's why I think this year is so extraordinarily important and really makes such a huge difference. Could you give us just 1 or 2 minute tease about your new book?
My new book is called Lessons from the Least of These, and it's out in December, but it really does lay out specifically what are the principles that should guide our understanding of why this country has gotten into tribalism. It gives a history of it that 1960s, there was a deliberate attempt to flood the system, bankrupt the system by pushing blacks onto welfare system. And that's when I talk about the disintegration of the family occurred when you separate work from income. But I think that it'll be an inspirational book because it talks about the process of redemption, how we move from brokenness and rebuild from the inside out. I think it's an important guide, and it talks a lot about faith. It talks a lot about principles, and it gives a lot of examples of when these principles and faith are applied the powerful and exciting redemption that you'll read about here. Examples of triumph and redemption in the face of oppression and disadvantage.
Well, I'm encouraging everybody to get a copy of the book. I'm encouraging them to look very seriously at the Woodson Center as a place that's doing work that really is central to the future of America. So thank you for your dedicated lifetime commitment, and I really appreciate your being part of this today.
Thank you, Newt.
And now I'll answer your questions. William K. from Maryland asked, when will the politicians that are behind the rioters be held accountable? Why aren't the liberal mayors, governors, and judges held accountable for allowing and ignoring the protest rioters? I think that's a great question, and I think presently we're going to have to adopt some laws that allow them to be sued. If a liberal city government fails to protect its city, there ought to be some right for the business that was destroyed or the home that was burned down to hold that government accountable. And it is truly appalling, not just in Seattle and Portland, which are obvious, but in Chicago, in St. Louis, in Baltimore, in New York, how really bad the Democratic big city politicians are and how much we have to do what is necessary to insist that Americans have a right to safety, they have a right to be protected, and that this is really a form of corruption, and we should deal with it as such. Thank you to my guest, Robert Woodson Sr. You can read more about the Woodson Center on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Debbie Myers, and our producer is Garnsey Slump. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Henley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. Please email me with your questions at gingrich360.com/questions. I'll answer them in future episodes. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcast and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. On the next episode of Newt's World, Dwight David Eisenhower was the supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe during World War II and the 34th President of the United States. Dwight David Eisenhower's dedicated service to our country spanned 50 years. We'll look at his extraordinary life on the next episode, part 1 in our 3-part The Immortals Dwight David Eisenhower series. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.